Broadcasting from Orchard Park, New York,
and Boca Raton, Florida,
it's the Freight 360 podcast. From freight broker sales tips to sports talk, this podcast is all about helping you grow as a freight broker. We're your hosts, Nate Cross
and Benjamin Kowalski.
Let's talk freight.
Hey, welcome to this week's episode of Freight 360. We've got a special episode. Nate is actually on Capitol Hill up there meeting with the FMCSA and Congress and lawmakers to, help understand what we can do with some of the issues we talk about on the show. So good luck to Nate out there this week. I think he's actually at a golf outing today, so hopefully he plays pretty well and represents our industry and our company on the course. Steven and I are going to be doing an episode. I think it's going to be a really good topic. We are going to dig into how freight brokerages provide value, what value actually means. And we hear this a lot is like, oh, we're a service. Most brokers compete. We have better service, right? Because it's a commodity at the end of the day, right? We want to talk about what that actually means. What is service and how do you define it? And what can you do differently? And what customers look for when working with a brokerage? And the difference between a shipper working directly with some motor carriers and a brokerage, and what and how those things differ and why, right? So before we kind of jump into it, let's get a little bit of sports recap. How did the Bengals do last weekend, buddy?
Well, in true fashion, playing the Chiefs, we lost to the refs. So that's how that went. Overall, it was a good game. Bengals usually start off pretty rough every year. And to have a good game like that against the Chiefs, it was refreshing to see that maybe we weren't on the same track as the previous years.
Progress.
But we'll see. Yeah. Excited to see what the next week has.
Who are you guys playing this week?
I'll be honest, I have no idea. I've got a baby due any minute and trying to get everything under control.
No.
At work, I'm just I'll forget the game's even on if I'm not paying attention. So.
For sure. Well, a little early congratulations. I know it's going to be literally around the corner. Hell, it could be later during this recording. I might lose you. It might be later today. It might be later this week.
Right. Yeah, she's 38 weeks, and this is our third, and our first one was 3 weeks early. So I'm just waiting on a phone call.
That's awesome. Did you catch? I know you had mentioned in the notes, and I heard about it, but I didn't get a chance to watch the game Sunday. I was at Disney on Ice with my daughter, but Tua, I know, got pretty much knocked almost into what people told me looked like he almost had like a convulsion, like that bad. I didn't see it though. Did you? Like a 3-yard line or something I heard, or was like very close to the end zone, and he just.
Yeah, I didn't see it, but I know he had another concussion like that. I think it was last season, where he had some posturing, which is pretty bad, and it seems like he maybe should be headed towards early retirement, but I'm sure the Dolphins will try to hold that out. But we'll see.
That's what I heard. Living in Dolphins country, I know it's top everyone's mind around here is on the local news basically every day. Steelers ended up pulling a win against the Broncos. I know the Broncos aren't looking terribly great this year, and Steelers got a little bit of criticism for not being a little more aggressive. But at the end of the day, a win is a win. So starting off the season 2-0, that's good enough for me. On the news front, I know you had posted something from Paul over at Freight Caviar. It looks like the dock workers strike looks almost certain. Looming U.S. East Coast port strike could disrupt 550,000 containers weekly, prompting shippers to turn to Canadian ports as a potential alternative. Anything more in this article? I got a chance to skim it, but anything worth digging into here?
For the most part, if you've been paying attention to it, it's just kind of highlighting what we already know, that they really haven't come to an agreement, and the potential for a strike is just getting greater and greater every day. I do know Freightways put out an article this morning, that President Biden had come out and said that he wouldn't be intervening in the strike, which added a little more certainty to what could happen. So we'll see. It could be a pretty good shakeup here in the next couple of weeks.
Time will tell. All right, well, let's dig into this, right? We were talking a little bit about this off air before we got on, and this has been top of mind as I've been talking with lots of clients about it, as well as like people on my team. you hear this all the time, right? Freight brokerage or shipping, it's a commodity, right? Like, I mean, again, I don't think a truck is a truck. I mean, there's different driver fitness, there are different levels of equipment maintenance in regards to reliability. So, I mean, I don't think it is, exactly the same across the board, but I think from an outsider looking at our industry, a truck picks something up from point A, gets it to point B, right? If another truck can do that, like they're very similar, it's kind of hard to differentiate beyond providing the thing that company needs, right? Shipper needs their product picked up, taken to their customer, distribution center, wherever that is, that's the thing they're paying for. So we always hear all the time, all these large, especially the large freight brokerages, and one that I used to work at is like, hey, we've got the best service, right? We compete on service, right? Well, like I really want to dig into what does that mean? Like, what is service? How do folks define that? What does that mean in our industry? And how and what are the things that somebody can do to actually compete more competitively, against the market so that they can get more business or service? I'll throw that out there, their customers better than they maybe were by other brokers or even carriers or any providers, whether it's a 3PL or 4PL or direct to carrier relationship, right? So, and I want to start kind of with you with this is like, what does that mean to you? Like, what does service mean in the context of a freight brokerage? How would you say you provide service? Would you say you provide good service? Start there. Would you say you provide excellent service? What is your opinion of your ability to
Yeah.
work with a shipper?
So I think the biggest thing for people to understand is like service isn't necessarily a step-by-step process that's written in stone. It's going to vary from customer to customer. So, for example, say you've got a customer like I don't know, Nike or Nestle that's really big and established. They're going to have a transportation department, and that service that you're providing is going to be different than, say, the mom and pop butcher shop down the street that has no transportation department or any idea on how transportation works. So you need to kind of look at your customers and see what is it that they need and how can I provide the service. So for example, if it's a mom and pop shop, you're going to have to educate them on how the supply chain works. Like if they're shipping in different areas, how does produce affect their rates? And you're more of a educator and a mentor to this customer versus someone like a Nike who some of the people you're working with are probably previous brokers that wanted to get out of the hustle and grind. So they know the industry. They just want to know that you can communicate what you're doing, how you're doing it, and that their product is going to be on time.
Mm-hmm. So, and I think that's a good point, right? And I think the thing I think that precedes that, right, is like, well, how do you know what is important to anybody you're working with? And I don't care if it's freight brokerage, insurance, real estate, financial services, software. If you are selling into anybody, you first need to understand a little bit about them, right? Like, what is going on over there? What might they need? What might be valuable to them with someone they're working with in whatever context that is, right? And the best way to do that is to first ask questions, right? Like you've got to learn a little bit more about them, right? And again, Nate always gives me shit about it, but like, whether it's a proverb or not, like God gave you 2 ears and one mouth, right? Like use them proportionately. I think about that all the time because again, I enjoy sales. I'm an extrovert. I like to talk, right? My daughter's this way, right? Like she has a very hard time listening because she's so excited about what she's going to say. I think that's really common for personality types of people that tend to go into these industries, right? And that's not a bad thing, right? But again, there is the other side of it, meaning like you really have to be, or at least myself, I'll speak for myself, is I think I work on this every day, is even when I'm excited to share something, I'm not learning anything about them if I'm talking. I'm learning when they're talking and I'm listening, right? So I get more valuable information listening than I ever get talking, right? Now, for sure, once I've understood where they might have gaps in either their understanding, to your point, of how the market works, how and what we can do in different scenarios, then I fill those gaps, hopefully, with information that is relevant to them. So it helps them make better decisions or makes their job or life easier, right? Like that to me is like one of the paramount first things that you need to do. Ask questions, learn and understand where is this customer or prospect in the industry, right? How long have they been in it? How are they operating, right? Because the one thing I want to say, right, that I think is important to the context of this conversation is I think, again, a lot of us assume that when you call into a large company, and I'll start with a big one, that if you're speaking to somebody in logistics at a very big company, that they know more than you do about the industry, or that they have more experience. Maybe they do.
Have you fallen victim to double brokering, cargo theft, or identity theft? QuickScope stands out as the only load-level fraud protection tool available today. Unlike any other solution on the market, QuickScope is deployed post-agreement between shippers or brokers and carriers. Shippers can rest assured that their cargo remains secure. Brokers can confidently confirm the identity of the individuals on site for pickup, and carriers can trust that they'll receive timely payment. Start your free trial with QuickScope today by visiting them online at quickscope.com. That's QUIKSKOPE.com. Blue Book Services is the resource you need if you're transporting fresh produce or lumber. Their online databases contain thousands of companies throughout the produce and lumber industry supply chains. You can easily search their databases to generate new sales leads. Blue Book's credit ratings help you avoid companies with high credit risk, and their team can help resolve disputed loads. To learn more, go to producebluebook.com or lumberbluebook.com and click Join today.
But how they operate is very differently than how a freight brokerage operates, right? And because of that, they see things differently. So, for instance, if you had to book your own trucks, now think about this for any freight broker out there. If you've got loads to move, doesn't matter how many numbers, right? Say it's 10 loads this week or 20 loads this week. If you're a shipper, you have a stagnant list of the carriers you can reach out to, right? Like you aren't getting access to the market in real time. You've got a list of your approved carriers and brokers. You send out the loads, they give you rates, you choose the best rate correlated with maybe the service of that, meaning on time percentage for that company that has worked with you in the past. They try to get the best price with the best service, right? But again, they're static. They don't change on a given week. And think about it, like when we need to get onboarded with one of these larger companies, whether you're a carrier or a broker, like it takes a week or two. You got to get the paperwork, you go through procurement, you sign the agreements. There's a whole process to vet who they work with as a vendor before they can even start to use them, right? It's a very much longer time frame than us as a brokerage. Now let's take what it looks like for a freight broker, right? You got 10, 20 loads. We are accessing the open market all day. Now, again, I'm going to assume that we're covering loads from a load board for newer brokers out there, but that's what I mean by the market. Whether you're calling carriers directly or calling posted trucks or emailing carriers, like you're accessing the market, right? And the thing that is different that we see that I don't think shippers see as much is take Friday afternoon, for example, right? Like we used to call it a TQL, like Fallout Friday, right? Because in the afternoon, when loads have to get picked up that day because they can't sit there over the weekend, right? It's very common sometimes for a shipper to have a steady rate all week, and then that carrier can't pick up the load for whatever reason, right? But say it's 1 o'clock in the afternoon, they go to recover that load. They send the same load details and rates to us as brokers and carriers and expect us to be able to get us the same truck for the same price as if they gave us that load on Monday. And any broker out there knows the price at 3 o'clock on Friday afternoon to get a truck loaded by the end of that day is not the same price as if you booked it at 9 in the morning on Friday, and certainly not Thursday and maybe not Monday or Tuesday, right? Why? Because we are really in the market. And what does that mean, right? So like, just say you've got a lane coming out of like somewhere rural. Like, I don't know, I always kind of pick Sparks, Nevada because it just sticks in my head. Like there's not much around it. So if you've got to get a load picked up from there and you've got 4 hours to pick it up, there might literally only be 6 trucks within 150 miles of that facility that meet your requirements, that have that insurance, that are empty and can actually physically drive there, pick up that load before they close. So it doesn't really matter what DAT, truck stop, or any rating tool says what you should pay, because what you will pay is what you can negotiate with those 10 dispatchers. And if all of them want $1,000 above market, that is the best you're going to be able to pay. That is the accessing of the open market, right? And that's a perspective we see as freight brokers that our customers just usually don't see unless they were brokers, because they don't operate the same way. They don't have the same tools. They're not built with software like we have to vet a carrier in 30 seconds to determine their insurance, their out of service percentage, their driver fitness, their ability to vet fraud. We do this in a very small amount of time. They take days and weeks to do what we do in minutes or seconds, right? So we see a very different market with very different fluctuations than they get from their perspective. Now, they might assume and they might, believe they know what that means, but until you experience it, I think it's very different, right? And I think that's some of the context that you were just saying is like when you're educating a shipper, your customer, trying to explain what is different in different scenarios, they very well might not know what that means. So it is incredibly valuable if you can explain it to them in a way that doesn't come across condescending and make it seem as if like you know everything and you're telling them how to do their job, which I think is also important. Like, how do you approach that?
Yeah, I would agree. And it's just, I mean, kind of like you were saying before, 2 ears, one mouth. So you kind of have to listen. You take cues on the phone. I mean, none of this happens. None of this booking the freight. None of this finding carriers. None of that happens until you get a customer. So before you get a customer, you have to prospect and you have to cold call. So you're going to have to talk to these people. And when you're talking to them, you get an understanding of their personality type. Some people, you can talk to them as an educator. Some people, you got to take a more personal route. It just depends on the personality type and how receptive they are. So some people will appreciate the educator tone and they will lean into your perceived expertise. Whereas other people, they just want to talk, which is perfectly fine. And then one thing I wanted to mention, and to like take a step back when you were going through the booking the freight and all that, is for the listeners out there, there are different freight brokerage models. So service could be different. So for like me, example, I'm a cradle to grave employee. So I am handling the customer side and the carrier side. Some of the people that are listening might work for some of these larger brokerages that have a carrier side and a customer side. So your service may be taking care of your carriers, making sure that you're getting the lanes that they want for prices that they can. And then your counterpart, the customer-facing side, the brokers, are bringing in freight for you to cover with the carriers that you've established a connection with.
Yep.
So service could mean different things to this industry. It just depends on where you are and how you're being tasked to work.
Correct. And I think that's one of the things, like you have advantages of, we'll call it a pod model where it's split between two different departments or two people. The advantage is you have efficiency, right? When people can do the same task over and over again, they get better at it, they get faster at it, and it's easier to stay in one lane to get more work done. Go back to Henry Ford and the manufacturing line. That's what pioneered this, right? Specialization. Do this thing over and over again. You get faster at it. The guy next to you does this thing all the way down the line, right? Now, the disadvantage to your point is communication, right? Like if you're just talking to customers, you're also now removed in the same way the shipper is, right? Because all you hear is what your rep is telling you and rates and things. Sometimes you get as much information as you need. Sometimes you don't get nearly enough. And I think like when I've worked in these scenarios, like communication is really important. Like you want to ask these questions as to what they're seeing, what they're hearing, right? Because the market can shift from day to day, afternoon to morning, right? You need to be aware of these things when you're dealing with a customer from the carrier side so that you can help educate your customer or help let them know how and when you can help them. Hey, look, if you get this load and you need it covered by 10 in the morning, I can probably get you a 22. If I got this at 2 in the afternoon, I'm probably going to be at 2600 for this lane because like there just aren't that many trucks late in the day and they tend to get all booked in the morning. Again, if that's a scenario and your team's telling you this is really valuable information to provide back to your shipper, right? That is, again, one other definition of service. The other thing I wanted to ask you about, and I thought about this a lot lately, right, is to a lot of shippers will have benchmarks of the size of assets they want to work with for a motor carrier. Like we only want to work with carriers that maybe have 50 or more trucks. Maybe it's 100 or more trucks. Maybe it's 25 or more, right? Now, it's not always the case for sure, but there are definitely them out there. And if you've prospected enough, you've seen this, especially from the carrier side, right? Why do you think that some shippers have preferences to work with a carrier that has a larger number of assets versus a lot of carriers with a smaller number of assets? Like if I have a choice as a shipper and I can choose 2 carriers that have 50 trucks each or 5 carriers that all have 10 trucks, why do you think they have a preference for the larger carriers over the smaller ones?
In freight, time is money and efficiency is key. That's where Levity comes in. Imagine automating your email operations to do more with less effort. Levity connects directly to your inboxes, extracting vital information from emails and attachments in real time. It seamlessly integrates with your TMS, empowering you to quote faster, build loads more efficiently, and book more freight in less time. Whether it's incoming emails from shippers or carriers, Levity's got you covered. It understands any language, any format, and even interprets non-standard formatting. Visit levity.ai today to sign up and get started.
Tired of struggling to find accurate rates and the right carriers for your freight? With DAT1, you can access more than 500 million posted loads and trucks every year. That's 3 times more capacity than any other load board. Plus, their integrated freight management system makes it easy to cover loads 24/7. They have the most trusted network of carriers, brokers, and shippers in the country. You'll get real-time rates on every lane so you know exactly how much a shipment will cost before you commit to it. Plus, you get instant access to top bids from qualified carriers around the country. Get 10% off your first year of DAT1 when you visit the link in the show notes.
Well, to become a larger carrier, you have to be somewhat organized, and you have to have processes in place that can provide communication. So there's a level at which the growth of the company starts to match some of the service to a brokerage, because they have to build out these things to provide service for dedicated customers. Now, for the shipper, I would say that's short-sighted, because they could have a single truck company that is in their backyard that likes to go to the place local. So now that one guy, they're missing out because they've limited their scope to this many carriers. But it also brings their vetting process and approved vendor process narrower and more streamlined, so that they can get people approved fast. So you can see why a shipper would do it, but it also cuts themselves short, which is why brokerages are usually included in the vendor list, because we will work with that guy.
Yes. So, and I want to go back, right? Because let's go with the obvious ones. The obvious ones are, if you're a company, you want the smallest number of vendors. Why? Because you got to write less checks. You have to reconcile less accounts. It's less work for accounting. It's less work for the accounts receivable and accounts payable, right? It's also less risk to the company, because every time you bring a vendor on, there is some inherent risk. Not more and less in different scenarios, but like there's always a preference in procurement to have less vendors than more, because it's more work, there's more chance of mistake, and they got to hire more people to reconcile more accounts, right? Now, the second obvious one, well, if you've got 50 trucks, it's more likely you'll have a truck when I need one than if you have 5, right? Just the obvious one. More tends to be more likely that you would be able to help. Now, I don't think that's necessarily true, because some of the larger carriers like literally have more dedicated freight and less drivers that need loads in some scenarios. So like they literally have less availability sometimes than the smaller ones. But I do think that is a common belief, right? And now I want to segue into the one that you talked about, which is I think really important, which is smaller carriers, right? Like there's only so many people there. Like think 5 trucks, think 1 truck owner op, right? Like if you've got to drive your own truck, like you've got to make sure you are up to regulation on your equipment. You got to make sure it's serviced. You have to literally do the hard work of physically driving a truck, making sure you're safe, making sure you're rested, making sure you're doing the physical job correctly, because there's a lot of risk driving 80-some thousand pounds down a highway when there are pedestrians and, just cars on the road. Like that is a huge thing that you need to pay attention to, that to me is far more important than anything else, right? So once you have those, right, like there's only so many hours in a day. So like even if you're very organized, it's very difficult to find time to talk to shippers and to call them out from a sales perspective. It's also very hard to be available when a shipper actually needs to speak to you. Because like if a shipper has a problem, they don't know when that problem's happening. Like they come up unexpectedly by definition in our industry. So if it's 12:15 and all of a sudden this shipper needs help and they want to call that smaller company, it's harder sometimes to reach somebody that can even answer the phone, let alone respond to an email, because they literally might be driving a truck, right? So like that is the first thing that I think is important. The second is like organization, right? Like smaller carriers tend to be very good at driving and doing those things, but tend to not necessarily have their arms around exactly what their costs are, their expenses, which loads they moved like last week. And even if they do, like to be able to have that paperwork readily available if a shipper needs, hey, can you resend me that certification? Can you resend me that paperwork, right? They either have to wait till they pull over, or hopefully there's a dispatcher that can do it. But again, that is a whole other job to do on top of a very important one. which just makes it harder to do, right? So what are some of the things that you think you've done as a broker that helps bridge the gap between a smaller carrier that is a better fit for the lane that the shipper needs, to your point? They probably will give you a more favorable rate sometimes because that lane really might work for that driver. Like he's literally either deadheading or getting random brokered loads back home. And there's a shipper that has that load every week on the same day he's there, and it would be the perfect fit. Meaning like the driver would benefit tremendously and the shipper would, but like they can't work together for these reasons. How do you bridge that gap? And what are some of the things you do to help make sure the right carrier can work with the right load for that shipper?
So there's two sides to that. There's two answers to that question. The first one being the customer facing side, which is, you know, I have this carrier that's really good for this lane. It's a great fit. They just can't handle the volume, or maybe they have an issue, something breaks down. So that means me as a broker, I need to have backups available so that there's no service
That's
gaps.
important. Yep.
And the customer needs to know that regardless of whatever the issues are, that this freight is going to get picked up and delivered on time.
So
Whether or not
pause
the
there.
carrier,
Yeah, because I'm going to pause there for a second, right? And I want to set the scenario for everyone. So if you've only got one driver as an owner op and he's supposed to pick up a load in Memphis going to Pittsburgh, and say he's picked up that load 4 weeks in a row, no problem, every Thursday at 10 a.m. But let's just say tomorrow, or like this Thursday, that truck at no fault of his own was stuck at his receiver, right, way longer than he was supposed to because that receiver, right, was short staffed. 2 people called off sick. They got 1 guy unloading trucks instead of 3, and it takes 5 hours to unload the truck instead of the normal hour and a half. So this truck is just literally a victim of the circumstance. But the shipper's like, well, I need to make sure my load still picks up, right? So from there, what are we able to do as a brokerage that a motor carrier or a smaller one can often not be able to do?
so to answer that, it's we can source another truck. Sometimes if we're alerted soon enough, if the carrier is that good and we know in advance, the
Yep.
shipper may not even know that we've replaced that truck. The pickup facility should know because we should be relaying who's picking this up.
The
and all
MC's
that
picking
to
up.
prevent
It's a different truck showing up.
fraud.
Correct.
But your customer, who may or may not be on site,
Yep.
will never know the difference. Now, to go back to the carrier side, you have a good carrier that's really consistent. If he was working with that shipper, he may have a service failure that may prevent him from picking this load up again. Whereas us as a
Yes.
broker, it's like, hey, no harm, no foul, no big issue. Just get your stuff fixed, sort it out. And then when you're ready to go, we'll put you back on the lane. So now you've maintained that rate, you've maintained that relationship. And then on the backside, he got stuck at a receiver that
Yep.
wasn't a good fit. So me as a broker is saying, well, why did you get stuck? Who were you working with? How can I help? What are you looking for? How can I? So now
Yeah.
I've got lead generation built into my carrier relationship that I can now go source freight for this carrier to make sure he's getting back on time.
And in addition to that, right, like you can either help that carrier find another or more effective load to at least get him back without losing a ton of money or having to get a random load. You can help, to your point, prospect that area to maybe find a better lane that works better for that carrier that is more reliable. But we can literally go and help create more value for that motor carrier. And we've created better service for the shipper because to them, the load was still picked up on time. It was still delivered on time, even though we were able to, in our words, like recover that load with another carrier from the market, again, to the earlier point, in maybe like 5 minutes or 10 minutes, right? We can do that very quickly, accessing the market. A shipper is not able to. The best they're going to do is email a bunch of motor carriers, hopefully first, probably, and they're going to go, well, hey, man, I can't reposition an asset in 45 minutes to get that load. I can get it tomorrow. And the shipper goes, well, it's got to pick up today. This is now where the brokers can come in, access any available trucks that meet their requirement in this very short amount of time to make sure the service to the shipper is steady. Every load was still picked up on time. There's no difference to their customers, to their business, and we're able to provide value back to that motor carrier because of communication, right?
Right. And one thing when you're talking about the vendor getting trucks carriers established 50 plus, that vendor process. One thing that I thought about, I don't know if this is true or not. Maybe any shippers watching this could leave it in the comments, but I would imagine, especially your mid-size companies, shippers, probably have adopted a vendor process from their procurement for the raw materials and have established that to transportation. And
Yes.
it's not the same thing, because you can look at vendors for raw materials and you're like, look, I need this bulk thing at this price to make us profitable. So now you can whittle it down to a few and it's got to be X size. You
Yep.
do that to transportation, where I don't know what the stat is. DAT's put it out a few times, but the majority of your uh, capacity is not on load boards,
Correct. And here's
and
the
they're
other thing
smaller
too.
carriers.
I want to point out, like, because I have a few clients that are very large shippers, a few of which that are starting their own brokerage, and I'm helping them, one, get it up, get the operations streamlined. I mean, one is enormous, like very large company. And what I wanted to say is, for the first half of this year, I sat on meetings almost monthly with their legal team and with their risk team. And this is like a $6 billion company, right? Like very large company. So to your point, we are sitting in conversations with risk and legal that want to put in procurement requirements, right? And again, think about it from their point of view. They want to mitigate risk. They want to protect the company from, catastrophic liability. They want to protect the company from all the things that they think could potentially harm them. But what they don't realize is they only have that point of view, right? Or that context. They're just looking at how to protect themselves, right? However, when I'm in these meetings, the thing I'm pointing out usually is like, hey, every time you change those and make those more stringent, you make it harder for this brokerage that you want to launch to actually solve the problem that your department has. And they're like, oh, well, some of our equipment, we'll say is, 750 grand, but most of our loads are whatever, $100,000. We want to raise most of our insurance requirements to whatever, 250,000 or $400,000. And it's like, okay, like that makes you less risky. However, that prevents your team from actually working with the carriers that are going to be available in the time you need it to keep the service you need for your customers. Actually being able to book these trucks as a brokerage, right? And when you don't have those two different points of view, to your point, as a shipper, they just create these agreements and these requirements based on what legal and risk says, and they go, just sign it or else. I can't tell you how many brokerages and people have reached out to us over the years to go, should we sign this agreement? It's ridiculous. It doesn't really make any sense. And we wouldn't even be able to book trucks if we followed this to the letter, right? And then the shipper will go, or the logistics person goes, oh, well, don't worry about that. Everyone just signs it and does it anyway. Well, that's even worse, because now the agreement has absolutely no ability to protect anybody from anything because nobody's paying attention to it, right? And again, different points of view create different situations, right? And I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, and to speak on that, I do. It's been a couple years, but I did work with a shipper that had their own brokerage. And by the time I had started working with them, their brokerage, because of this reason that you pointed out, had stopped hauling their freight because it was too difficult because of the restrictions that
Yep.
the owned company had put on them as a brokerage. So they stopped hauling their freight to maintain profitability and keep that brokerage open. Um, so I think it's, it is it a bad thing? No, but again, it's one of those things that you need to look at, because an insurance policy for a single truck of $100,000 and all the other general liability and all that stuff, I mean, that could be $30,000 a year that you're
Correct.
asking just for minimum. And now you want them to have 250, 400,000. I mean, your small fleet single trucks, they're not going to have that unless they have the customer that's writing the checks already.
Yep. Exactly. And I think, again, that's often overlooked from a shipper's point of view, and we see it all the time as a broker, right? So, like, what does service mean in that scenario? It means helping your customer sometimes understand how their procedures are creating their own problem, right? My favorite one in that same scenario is like, when we get this question a lot recently from a few episodes ago about like, well, what do you do when a customer wants to pay a lower rate and like they're so low, but yet they keep denying my quote, and then they come back to me, 4 hours later the next day and want me to move it, right? Those to me become really obvious, because like when I find out that a shipper just keeps doing this, trying to pay the absolute least rock bottom price in every scenario, right? Just think about this as a brokerage. What would happen if you tried to pay literally the lowest amount of money in every single load in every scenario? Do you think more of your trucks would fall out on you or less? Right? Like literally that policy and that procedure of trying to beat every truck and every broker down to the lowest absolute rate, regardless of the scenario, is going to create more trucks canceling, more fallouts, more rejections. That's why they end up running around like, with their hair on fire, constantly recovering loads. It's because this policy of pay the lowest no matter what creates more of the problem they're trying to solve, right? And again, you can't always get them to change what they're doing, but I think it's really helpful sometimes to be able to help them understand there is a correlation in some way between price and service. It's not direct, but if you're going to pay a fair rate, you will have less rejections and less fallouts. Trucks will stay on your loads longer. If you're paying somebody $1.50 a mile because that was the only truck and you had that only load at 9 a.m, and an hour and a half later, there's another load available for $2 a mile, I know it's not ethical. And I know we shouldn't be doing this in our industry, but it's in that carrier's best interest most of the time to just cancel that load, grab the other load, because they're literally losing money at $1.60 a mile. They only ran it because it was the only one available. If they can make a few dollars and not lose money, like, they're going to operate in their best interest. That's capitalism. That is why these trucks fall out more when people do more of this.
Right. And if you want to pay the lowest rates, just understand your name will be dragged through a Facebook group somewhere. The most common thing I see right now is screenshots of brokerages posting dirt cheap loads, and then in the comments you'll see someone saying, "Oh, I know this lane. It's this shipper, this receiver, and they're blah blah blah." So, can you do it? Yes. Is it great? No. Or do you want your name dragged? Because look at like Costco. Drivers love going to Costco because they're in and out. Those lanes typically are good paying, and they have a good name. They have a good reputation. And that's how you'll continue to maintain service at the level that you desire, by not pitting people against each other.
Yes. Now, I want to talk a little bit about emails. Okay. What does service in the context of written or email communication mean to you? What are some of the things that maybe you do differently, I don't know, or better, or however you want to define it? What do you do and what have you learned related to how you email and communicate with your customers in the context of service?
So I'm going to sound like a broken record, but again, it's one of those things that over the last 5 years that you tailor your communications to your audience. That's what you're doing.
Yes.
Your audience is your customer, or it's the carrier in some cases, and you have to understand what is it that they want to hear and when. So, for example, I have customers that, if something goes wrong, I may or may not have to tell them. Just depends on the severity of the situation. I can handle it and then send them an email recap afterwards, and that's all they want. I have other customers that need to know the minute something happens, and I have to communicate that as fast as possible. And then in the context of how I do it, some of them are older, so it's got to be a little more formal. Yes, sir, no, ma'am. And some of them are my age. We're more friendly. And it's writing my email is almost like sending them a text. I can misspell words and it's not a big deal, but it's catering your communications to your audience and their expectations. And that's what the service is.
Agreed. And I think, again, it goes back to asking questions to really understand what would be helpful, right? Call it valuable, helpful, call it whatever you want, right? Like, if you're my customer, I'm going to ask you before onboarding, hey, Steven, I know you had said you want tracking on these loads. What's your preference for tracking? Do you want real-time updates fed to you all day through emails every hour? Do you want a portal that you can log into and see it when it's convenient for you? Or do you want updates sent to you once in the morning, once in the afternoon? I think everyone kind of assumes more is better, right? But I can tell you, when you're on the receiving end, like, I don't want 45 additional emails sometimes on communication. Like, that makes my job harder, not easier. Sometimes you need communication literally twice a day. On some loads, you want it more because maybe there's more risk, there are more reasons that it could go wrong, and the customer needs to know more because their customer needs to know more for whatever reason, right? Sometimes they want more updates closer to before it picks up, once it's loaded and once it's rolling, then once a day. Then they want an update 3 hours before it delivers to make sure they know nothing's wrong and they can notify the customer if they need to reschedule a delivery for whatever reason, right? It very much depends on what is going to be helpful to your customer, not what you want to do or what you assume should be helpful to them. Ask the question, right? Again, like, Assumption is like the mother of all F ups. That was a line from like, I think, Under Siege in the 90s, but like it always stuck with me because like anytime you're just assuming something, you should ask yourself that question. Did they say they would need this? Would this be helpful? And don't guess. Ask the question. Pick up the phone. We always talk about, and everybody asks, like, well, how do I find more reasons to talk to a prospect or a customer? How do I follow up? What do I say? All these things that we don't know yet, these are reasons you can use to pick up the phone, to call a prospect, and to ask a few questions. Another opportunity to build some rapport and learn a little bit more about them, right? Because just assuming that because one company you've worked with likes it this way does not mean the next person you're working with, even at that same company, wants it the same way, especially at a different company, right?
Right.
The
One of my favorite quotes that my grandfather told me, it started the company, is and we can edit this out if we need to, but to assume just makes an ass out of you and me.
Correct.
And that's 100% what it does. Whether
Yes.
it's
They're my two favorite sayings related to assumption.
yeah, whether
Yes.
this carrier fell out and you assume, oh, I don't need to tell them, I'm just going to recover this. You're causing issues.
Correct.
So yeah,
Well, that's a good
that
one
is
too. Segueing into, bad news does not get better with time. If something is wrong, the best time to tell your customer is immediately. Their biggest fear is that something has gone wrong and they're unaware of it and they can't plan or change things because of it, right? To me, that is one of the most important things in service for a brokerage is if you aren't knowing where your trucks are before their pickup, before their delivery, and letting your customer know before the pickup or before the delivery that it needs either adjusted or they will be late for whatever reason, those things are almost always solvable and aren't really a problem if everyone knows before. If you wait until after and their customer, their loading dock, their distribution center sends the email to them and goes, there's no truck here, it's 10 o'clock, it's quarter after 10, where are they? Now, the customer that you work with looks bad because they don't look like they know what's going on with the people they booked. You look bad because you didn't communicate it to them, right? And the whole situation just gets worse, right? None of those things get better by waiting and hoping. And I think that goes to something I was talking about earlier a few weeks ago. Is like, that is a difficult conversation. That is why people don't do it. That is why shippers are scared to work with newer brokers. They're terrified that when something's wrong and there's a difficult conversation to be had, you're going to avoid it and hope it gets better. It does not. You are not going to be successful in this industry if you are afraid of dealing with conflict or owning up to a mistake, even if it wasn't your own. You've got to stand up for the carrier. Sometimes maybe it was a driver issue, maybe it wasn't, but you've got to be the first person to own up to that scenario, make that phone call ahead of time, and be honest and transparent with what happened. And then, more importantly, what you're doing to solve it or remedying it, right? Because if you go to somebody and you let the shipper know this is an issue and then tell them how you're going to solve it, okay, that's helpful. Not telling them at all does nothing but make their life more difficult and less likely for them to want to work with you, right?
right. And the worst form of communication, the worst contact your customer can get is an update on their load that didn't come from you. Good or bad, if it comes from somebody else, they learn information
Correct.
about a load that they gave to you.
It's like a black eye.
Yeah, it's not good. So staying ahead, and then again, if it's bad news, writing in an email is probably, especially if it's a new customer.
You should not be sending bad news in an email
Yeah,
ever. Pick up the phone
yeah,
and, pardon the gender, but like man up, for like the old saying. Like, I don't care if you're a guy or a girl, right? I think
right,
the saying is appropriate. Like, stand up for it. Look them. I mean, again, you can't look them in the eye, but like if you could, that would have been the best, right? If something goes wrong, the absolute best way to address it is to look that person in the eye and tell them, right? The second best is the phone. If you are sending an email, it is very obvious that you are too scared to call them. And there is nothing that irritates me more when a coworker does this, when anybody does this to me, especially people that I talk to twice a day. And then when something goes wrong, all of a sudden they're sending me an email. Like, why are you sending me an email? Like, you call me about everything else you've ever needed to tell me in the whatever months or years I've been working with you. And all of a sudden, when something gets difficult, I got to read a 2-paragraph email. I don't even read them. I literally will pick up the phone as soon as I get those emails and go, like, why'd you send me this email? What's going on? Because again, you can't really address it. To me, that reminds me of like the internet keyboard warriors, right? Or like, oh, they're going to be super tough guys and do all these things behind a computer and behind a pseudonym and no one knows who they are, right? Like, this is a professional setting. Like, you need to have the character to stand behind your work. If you can't stand behind it and put you in front of it or, behind that work, to me, that's not integrity. That's not character. Like Nate talks about that from his old boss at LDI that used to say that you have two things in this industry, your phone and your integrity. And if you lose one, you're screwed, right? Integrity and character to me go hand in hand in that scenario.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, just the nature of our position, like we are the middleman. So sometimes, most times, that bad news is not a direct result of us, but we still have to have that conversation. So it's the best way to look at it is to take that opportunity to practice that skill of bad news and delivering it.
Yes.
Because
The more you
on the
practice it, the
flip
easier you
side,
get, the better you get at it, the easier it gets.
right, and that'll translate straight to your cold calls and your prospecting as well. It'll make you more confident on the phone. They may say whatever, insert, common objection here. And if you're giving bad news to customers, not that you want to do that all the time, but that will help you take on those objections a little bit easier. And then you can just go on to the next cold call, or you can break it. But it's all a practice on your tone and your composure on the phone. And that's one way to look at it.
It's funny. I'm reading a book right now from my book club, and it's on risk. And the book talks about gamblers and professions that are in high stress scenarios, like literally high stakes gamblers, guys that are on like World Series of Poker, hedge funds, companies that make huge bets, but also folks that take like very large risks, climbing mountains in the military, any context of that, right? And the thing they talk about in the beginning is that like nobody's immune to that feeling of nervousness. Like that is a physiological response to fight or flight to fear, right? That is why your face gets red, your blood vessels change. The blood literally will move from your brain down to your extremities as if you feel like you want to run. Why? Because it's a survival instinct, right? The reason you see people achieve high levels and operate in those, and you'll hear them say, like, oh, they're immune to risk, or like, oh, they don't have a tilt button, like they don't get upset. They are not physiologically different people. They did not grow up in some weird place where like they just don't feel the same fear we do. It's that they've practiced this more. They've done this over and over again. So when they feel that in their chest and that uncomfort and that fear that prevents everybody from having that conversation, the reason it's easier for them to do is because they've done it more, right? Harder things get easier the more you do them. They do not get easier by avoiding them and hoping that they get easier later, right? The last thing I wanted to cover and segue into a little bit is like communication related to carriers, right? And versus the shippers. And this is something that I've run into recently a few times with a couple customers. And the first thing I want to point out is we are intermediaries. We're in the middle, right? So the first thing I want to point out is anytime you get information from a carrier, before you send it to your customer, you need to verify it. Why do you need to verify it? You need to verify it because as soon as it comes out of your desk or your mouth to them, it's now your responsibility. You are going to be held accountable for that information. Does that ring any bells with you or provide any?
Yeah, I had this issue literally last night. I have a lane that we cover with a larger carrier, and at like 5 o'clock, the dispatcher sent me an email and said, "Hey, this truck's still not loaded. We're not moving yet." So I'm emailing him to verify. Try to call him with this answer, and then I get in touch with the cold storage, and I said, "Hey, I'm being told this truck's not loaded yet. They've been there for going on 5 hours now. Can you give me an update? What's the issue?" And the response back, and then my customers are in this email as well. The response I get back is, "Oh, they've been loaded for an hour. Here's the BOL, the checkout time." So now I look like an idiot because this dispatcher could not get back to me. So I got to handle that this morning, which is what I was doing before we got on here. Is like,
Yep.
why are you? Because the issue was the dispatcher was looking at the ELD and not looking at or talking to the actual driver.
Yep.
So the driver still showed up on site, but that's because he drove out of the dock, parked his truck, and started his 10 hours because they were going to let him stay overnight. so he could run first thing in the morning. Perfectly fine, but the dispatcher didn't see it that way. He thought he was
Exactly.
still in a dock, which is the issue. Now, is that a common mistake? It can be, yes, but they need to be more clear.
Trust but verify, right?
Right, exactly.
And I'll give you a couple. Like one, I had a tanker going to pick up at a customer, and we had to send priors over. Like for lots of tanker loads, they need to have a certification letter on letterhead from that carrier that these are the last 3 loads were in that tanker, because some have approved priors, meaning like there are some commodities that can go in that tanker before and some that can't, right? Because they don't want some chemicals to mix and other reasons, right? And I sent one over and I didn't look at their kosher certificate, and the trailer that they certified wasn't on the last updated kosher cert. Now, again, it wasn't the end of the world because they were on the new updated one. But what happened was I sent this to the customer, and the customer, literally the owner of the company, was on copy, and he's a very detail oriented person. He immediately went and looked, saw it, and emailed back, right? So now everyone else in that company was at least aware that I sent this over without letting them know I needed to also send the updated kosher certificate, right? Again, not the end of the world. I was able to go back, get the updated one, and everybody was fine. But it was just another reminder that anytime information is coming out of your mouth, your computer, whether you're writing it or saying it, you're now responsible for it. So you need to make sure whatever you're getting is accurate before you move it on to the next piece, right? And the last thing I wanted to say too, just related to this, is one of the other ways we were really able to provide value is like I've had so many shippers even in the past year, right? That like, again, we're in the same scenario, like they didn't want to work with smaller carriers. However, they wanted to pay lower than market rates. And just some examples, like we'll say the more organized carriers in that market, in that area of the country, they'd want like $4,500 per load. Well, some of the smaller carriers were willing to run it for say $3,000 or $3,500. And the main reason is like the bigger company needed more money because they have more staff. They have more back office people working there. They have more people organizing these documents, making sure they're there and available. And they have literally paying people to answer the phone. The smaller carriers literally had somebody, sometimes it was like part-time, a few days a week, to get paperwork arranged because they're not profiting enough to have more people there yet. They're growing, right? But the reality was the shipper wanted the better rate with a smaller carrier. But in the past, when they worked directly, they couldn't get the documents on time. And it was, again, another reminder for me of like, I was able to work with the smaller carriers, pull 2 or 3 of them together instead of the shipper working with one larger carrier, just like we were talking about earlier. And then what I'm literally doing is help coaching and training this motor carrier, the smaller one, to get me these docs in advance. And what does that mean? That means like, not just sending load tenders over for the 6 loads they got to move this week. That means every day in the morning at 7 o'clock in the morning, I'm sending them the updated schedule for the next 7 days. Every day, every afternoon. Here's the updated schedule for the rest of the week, next 7 days, because things are changing. And again, a new dispatcher that sometimes works part-time isn't going to see every email. They might miss one. So it's my job to literally help organize the carrier because that's what they need, right? They needed somebody to operate almost like a dispatcher. Now, I'm not their dispatcher, but as a freight broker, I can operate like a pseudo dispatcher for them temporarily. Hey, just reorganizing you, just a quick reminder, this guy's got to be here. We need these documents for this load. We need this for this one. And when you do that every day, it helps coach like that carrier, the smaller one, into getting into the habits that we do all day because all we do is deal in information. They have way more responsibilities than I have in that scenario. They're going to make sure the tanker's clean. They're going to make sure that the equipment's running correctly, that it's serviced, getting the right drivers on the right ones. They're doing all these other things. I'm helping provide value to them by 1, the organization. And then 2, when they're emailing me, sometimes the subject lines don't match up to the right loads. I know what they mean. Like, oh, this load's delayed, but it's in the subject line of a different load. Well, if that went directly to my customer, honestly, they would be confused and my customer would get frustrated and say, look, I can't work with them anymore. What I'm doing in the middle is not just helping the carrier in some of these scenarios, I'm repackaging this information. So once I get it, to the earlier point, I'm going to verify it, maybe make a phone call or text message to make sure it was correct. Then I literally will rewrite the email, put the correct subject line, and then I send it to my customer. So to my customer, they feel as if they're working with a very large carrier at a much lower rate. The carrier is getting more business. In fact, in the past few months, they're able to add more trailers, more drivers, and they got more business. So they're growing, they're benefiting. My shipper benefits because they're getting what they need. And in the middle, I'm providing value to both. And again, I'm not making a ton, like maybe we're making like 12% margins on some of these scenarios. However, that value is going to both sides. Nobody's beating one side up or the other in these scenarios. Like we're literally creating value sometimes both for the carriers and the shippers in these scenarios so that they're able to work together because they're just not either staffed or have the training or maybe have the funds to be able to hire these people yet. We can help them grow. Then when they hire some people, then they're going to probably charge more rates and maybe they'll work with different people. But for the time being, like we're able to help carriers actually grow and do more when we do these things. And we're able to help service our customers again better by making sure communication is clear, concise, accurate, verified, and up to date, right? And those are the things that I think we provide back to shippers that people overlook when they hear the word service, right? Like it's just this big blanket term. And I think people just think it means, oh, I'll just get you a truck when you need a truck. Like that is like the bare minimum table stakes, right? The things we talked about in this episode, I think are really details, tips, however you want to look at it, that you can start applying to your business to do more business with your customers, to work with more carriers, to do more loads, to get better pricing in some scenarios, right? Like these to me are the things that make a freight broker excel. I don't know, better than the rest, compete. I mean, how would you define it?
Well, and so yeah, it makes you a more well-rounded service provider, not just to your shippers, but to your carriers, which again, we're an intermediary. The shippers pay the bills, but the carriers do the work, and we can't do anything without either. So we have to cater
Correct.
to both. And two of the things that I wrote down that I wanted to touch on from what you were talking about is the first one I wrote down was cash flow. Carriers run thin margins. That's just, especially in the market that we're in right now, cash flow is very important. And I know most freight brokers that are listening to this, you and myself, getting paperwork, PODs especially, that start the timer for payment from the carriers feels impossible sometimes because they're just caught up in all the other stuff that they need to do. And then they don't understand that if you don't send them that POD, you don't send them that invoice, they're still waiting. That 30-day timer hasn't started. It's not based on when they deliver. It's based on when you get the paperwork to verify that they have delivered. So it's educating on cash flow. And then adding on to that topic is, especially these smaller carriers, they may not understand their operational expense. So you need to be an advocate for your carriers to understand what the costs are for them, specifically to their company, and advocate for them, for your customers, because that creates a better relationship, that creates more stability, gets them better freight, and then they trust you. Now you can be pseudo sales for this company to go help them find other freight, which then is funneled through you. That's just more business.
Exactly.
The other thing I wanted to touch on, you were talking about emails. Man, I don't know. I could have one load with a carrier and I can get 40 different email threads on that one load. And it's like, dude, just keep it in the thread. Stop. Why are we starting a new email each time? But again, I mean, most of these carriers are, I always say blue collar boys with their diesel toys. They may or may not know how to work a computer, and then you've got to be that buffer between what the carrier is saying and how the shipper wants to see it. So you may get a bunch of information across multiple sources, and then you got to funnel it down and give it to the shipper.
Agreed. Sweet, man. Well, good conversation. Any final thoughts?
Go Bengals. I know Nate's not here, but the Bills seem to be having at least a better start than we are, but we'll see. I'm sure we might play them later this year. I can't remember.
Fair enough. And whether you believe you can or believe you can't, you're right.
That wraps up this episode of Freight 360. Check out the show notes for links to anything that we've referenced on this episode. And make sure to visit us online at freight360.net to see our entire library of episodes, videos, blogs, and more.
And make sure to check us out on Facebook and subscribe to our YouTube channel for daily and weekly tips and content. And if you'd like your question answered on the show, fill out the Contact Us form on our site, and we'll see you next week.